Well, globalists are about to meet this fall to plan a technocratic takeover. That's what our next guest calls the upcoming United Nations meeting called Summit of the Future, where nations will sign this so called Pact for the Future, and they are expected to declare a planetary emergency. Okay, all of those things sound a little bit worrying. Let's keep an eye on this. Derrick Broze is an independent journalist who writes for The Conscious Resistance. He brought this to our attention, so we invited him on to tell us all about it. Thanks for coming back on Redacted.
Thanks for having me back, Natalie. Appreciate it.
Okay, so tell us what this is. Did I get this right? It's a planetary emergency now that they're declaring in order to give themselves power?
You have it absolutely right. I would say that probably most of your audience is familiar already with some of the other globalist meetings in the works, including coming up very soon here in May, the World Health Organization's pandemic agreement, pandemic treaty, which, as you guys are aware, is the same thing you just said. This is an agreement that they're going to give themselves powers or pretend that they give themselves powers so that in the case of some new claimed pandemic, they could declare an emergency and give themselves all kinds of fun powers, probably lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and things of that sort. This sort of ties into that in terms of the overall march towards a world government, which I think more and more people are realizing is the bigger picture for these organizations, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations. And my article particularly focuses on the Club of Rome, as well as another organization called the Commission for the Climate Commission, and another one called the Global Governance Commission. All these sort of globalist organizations tied together. And as you said, this September, September 22nd, 23rd, in New York City, during the United Nations General Assembly Week, which is an annual meeting, they're having this special meeting called the Summit of the Future that they've been working on now since at least 2020, in the early days of COVID. And so my article, I basically went to trace back, like where did these calls begin? This idea that we need to even remake the UN. They're talking about the idea of UN 2.0. And as you said, these discussions of declaring a planetary emergency, this idea that there are planetary boundaries. And instead of thinking about individual sovereignty or national sovereignty, we need to be thinking in terms of planetary sovereignty. And, that sounds maybe good on some level on the surface, but as we understand these people's true intentions, when you look beyond the surface, it gets a little bit more worrisome.
Okay, who do we need to be sovereign against then? And it's so this is beyond just climate change, which they've used to give themselves power. This is like our sovereignty against who?
Well, it's climate change definitely ties into this. Folks might be familiar with this term the World Economic Forum's been using in the last couple of years called polycrisis, which is becoming increasingly popular in the mainstream. You're probably going to hear it more. Or one of the ways they say we're facing a triple planetary emergency, and this would be climate change, pollution, and whatever else they want to. They tend to kind of throw different terms in there, but the point is they say we are facing a polycrisis, multiple crises at once, that is unprecedented in their view, and thus we need stronger international global systems to be able to better handle this. And I mean, I think things like climate change, obviously pandemics, these sorts of things, they, at least in the terms of the globalists, they make national borders less relevant, and that's what they want us to believe is for us to properly deal with these terms, we need to move beyond these terms of thinking of Texas or Florida or the United States, and instead thinking of as a global community. But I think anybody who understands these people's intentions, you're not going to throw a bunch of technocratic dictatorial governments into one world government and get something peaceful out of it. So I've been trying to raise the alarm on this, and if I could, I want to just to set the stage for folks. They started talking about this at the 75th anniversary of the UN in June 2020, which you might remember was the same month that the World Economic Forum announced their Great Reset initiative. All of this stuff is tied together. And at that time, the UN declared that we needed to, they were calling on Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, saying he needed to put out some recommendations. And at the UN 75th anniversary, they had a declaration that said, quote, "We will leave no one behind. We are determined to implement the 2030 agenda in full and on time. There is no alternative." And then shortly after that, Guterres put out a document called Our Common Agenda. And this is where he said, okay, we need to, quote, "forge new global consensus and prepare ourselves for the future." And that's when they set the date for this Summit of the Future. And as you mentioned, this is the part that kind of worries me the most. They're talking about signing this new global agreement, the Pact for the Future, where they're going to try to get as many of the world's governments on this to sign and essentially recommit to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the Agenda 2030, to the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, all these terms that they like to use. And there's talks of, as I mentioned, UN 2.0, of adapting or adopting new government governance models to even go beyond the UN and to make it stronger. And I've watched hundreds of hours now of these talks in the last week to try to get a better understanding. And when you listen to the presentations from the UN, from the World Economic Forum, from the Climate Governance Commission, and all these kind of tangential organizations that are related to this agenda, they discuss specifically it's time to move beyond national borders. It's time to rethink the way we are governing our world. I really believe that this meeting coming up in New York City in September and everything we're seeing leading up to it are going to be some of the biggest steps we've seen in recent years towards a global government.
Okay, so when they say planetary emergency, they do mean things that we can see and touch and feel. It's not like, oh, this threat of aliens, and that's why we need this space force. It's more.
It could be that.
Okay.
It,
That's where
yeah,
my
they
mind
definitely.
went.
I mean, I think that's a great place to take the conversation. They leave the door open. Obviously, right now they're focused on climate change, but it absolutely says so. The idea is essentially this. This has been popularized by a guy named Johan Rockström, who's from Sweden, working with a lot of these globalist organizations for the last decade. And he popularized the idea of planetary boundaries. He says that there are 9 different measures based on his research. And he says that humanity has already gone past 6 of them. So it's more kind of climate alarmism, end of the world alarmism. But what they're arguing is that we need to start looking at the world in terms of these different boundaries. And again, not national boundaries, but planetary boundaries. Now that those boundaries could be passed by climate change or other things, but absolutely claims of a UFO invasion or threats from outer space, any of these sort of and as I mentioned, of course, claim pandemics, any of these sort of emergencies would fit the bill. Right now, climate change is just the main argument they're using. But we should absolutely understand that once the World Health Organization treaty is in place, once the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future are signed, at that point, it's up to these governments to say, hey, here's an emergency. That could be an economic emergency. Many people are worried about, financial system. That could help them bring in the CBDCs. And that's another part of this. In one of their own documents, about the Summit of the Future titled What Would It Deliver? They say that it's time for a, quote, a global financial system that works for all people. So they're definitely talking about remaking the financial system along with all of the governance model. So we're talking about a complete remaking of the world as we know it. And as I was doing more research, even beyond my article, it looks like after the Summit of the Future in September, if they do sign this Pact for the Future, that some of these organizations are trying to use the United Nations Article 109, which is basically, it can be implemented. It's very rare, and this is why it would be a big deal. But this would be implemented to actually change the UN Charter, which is essentially the United Nations Constitution. And they're talking about by 2025, 2026, being able to actually rewrite the entire Charter of the United Nations to give themselves further power. So we're really in the middle and kind of watching as they're taking these big steps towards giving themselves more powers that they never should have in the first place. These are unelected people, as we know with the United Nations, World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, which is really where all this leads to. And maybe we can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, what is the Club of Rome?
So the Club of Rome has been around since 1968, and they're just, the most basic way is another one of these globalist organizations that has been warning that climate change, or what they used to call global warming, is going to kill all of humanity. They are also part of the big promotion of overpopulation and essentially eugenics, which now they term population control, birth control, things like this. And the Club of Rome is actually instrumental in the beginning of the World Economic Forum. When you go back to trace the Club of Rome, you see now deceased Henry Kissinger. We know Henry Kissinger was a mentor to Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum. And at the World Economic Forum's 3rd meeting, they actually had the founders of the Club of Rome there. The Club of Rome in the early 70s released a report called The Limits to Growth. And this is a very well-known, infamous report because it's in this report that they say that they decided humanity should be used as the enemy. They said that basically we should start promoting the idea that humanity is the problem and humanity is endangering the planet. And they publicly say, oh, people are just misinterpreting our statements. We're just recognizing that the climate was going to get worse. But if you look at their words, you look up a gentleman named Dennis Meadows, who is one of the authors of that report with the Club of Rome, with the World Economic Forum. He openly talks about lowering the population and trying to bring the population down. That's what this really comes down to, this reducing carbon, net zero, Agenda 2030. At the end of it, at the heart of it, it is a eugenicist agenda. And that is what this is all about. And the Club of Rome was actually the first organization to start talking about the idea that we should declare a planetary emergency. They've been talking about it for, I'd say, probably decades, but they put out a report in 2019, right before COVID, called the Planetary Emergency Plan. And that's all part of this Pact for the Future, where they're saying we need to create an emergency platform that could be implemented anytime we recognize or they claim that there is an emergency. So this goes back to the Club of Rome, the Rockefeller Foundation, a lot of the same names that people are going to be familiar with. It's just being rebranded. And of course, they're selling it to people. They're trying to sell it to people like us, but they're also trying to sell it to the so-called developing third world nations to get them to go along with it. As I've been watching these video clips of the discussions about the Summit of the Future, nations like Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, African nations, they've been speaking up and saying, hey, we're being left out of this. How come none of our suggestions, our recommendations are being listened to? So it seems like there is some resistance, but I think that the goal of the globalists is not only to convince the world population that this is a good thing, but to convince these other developing nations that, come on, join us in this new Pact for the Future. We promise it'll be inclusive, it'll be diverse, equitable, sustainable, etc. But at the end of the day, this is about more power. It's another power grab by the same old players that we've been fighting for generations.
Yikes. Okay, well, I'm glad you broke it down for me because this is just as terrifying as it reads in your article. And I'm going to suggest everyone read this piece by Derrick Broze. And, this goes along with, we just did a segment before you came on about the World Health Organization and how the pandemic treaty revision literally says that each party shall take steps to ensure that it has legal, administration, and financial frameworks in place to support emergency regulatory authorizations. So what they're saying is that anyone who signs this document has to break down their laws so that we can subvert it. That's exactly what they're saying. And it's written right there. So they have the right to go in, look at your country's laws and say, well, we can't break through these things. We can't enforce things on your population. So you need to weaken those so that we can penetrate. So this absolutely is happening. Why do you think it's so brazenly happening in public?
I think the reality is that there is more resistance than there probably ever has been. I mean, obviously, channels like yours are reaching millions of people. There's more and more people who are looking for this information. COVID 1984 woke up a lot of people and has caused many people to start questioning the so-called experts and the institutions that maybe, people went most of their lives generally trusting, okay, yeah, the FDA, CDC, they're probably doing their job. But then as people got a closer look at how these institutions operate, and then, of course, the people behind them, the globalist organizations, the more internationalist organizations, I think people are really seeing where this is going. Now, of course, this is still being deemed conspiracy theory by the mainstream, but we can also see in the mainstream the efforts to debunk and pre-bunk so-called conspiracy theories and misinformation. So they're ramping up their censorship. They're accelerating their plans. And this is because we're sitting here talking, it's April 2024. It's called Agenda 2030, and that's for a reason. They have a vision of completing this transformation of the world in the next 6 to 7 years. And the United Nations themselves, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other organizations, called the decade we're in right now, at the beginning of 2020, they called it the decade of transformation. So we are right here in the middle of this attempted transformation. And this is either going to be humanity stands up, we push back, whether that's protesting, spreading awareness, sharing videos like this and articles. I also think we need to put our energy into creating our own systems. They want to have a summit of the future. We need to have a people's summit of the future and think about, what does our pact to the future look like? What are we actually trying to create? Because if we know we reject their systems and we don't think there's, that's going to lead to privacy and liberty and freedom and all those things that we desire, then we need to also put energy as individuals, as families, as collectives, as species. What is the world that we want for 2030 and beyond? Because if we don't take active steps to create that, we are going to be swept up into these people's vision. And it is not a vision of freedom. It is not a vision of happiness. It is you will own nothing and be happy. And so I think if we know that that's not what we want, we need to keep spreading awareness as much as possible. We need to connect with other people who are interested in these ideas and who are looking for solutions. And that's why I'm here to share this with you and your audience.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for that empowering way to wrap this up, because sometimes we're just like, wow, they're doing this crazy stuff. We're watching, we can do nothing. So I appreciate this take that we can do something. So you can follow Derrick's amazing reporting at theconsciousresistance.com or on X at dbrozelive.free. So thanks for coming back on Redacted.
Thank you so much for having me, Natalie.
I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. You know, YouTube thinks that you'll actually like this next video right here. It's personalized based on your own viewing habits. So if you watch the video, please leave a comment. Let us know what you think about it. And we will see you next time, everyone.